Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The year past and the year ahead, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Toby Sells from the Memphis Flyer. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Burnell Smith, publisher, Tri-State Defender. Thanks for being here again.
Absolutely glad to be here.
So we look back at the biggest stories of the year and try to look ahead at some of the things we think will happen or we know are going to be happening. But to do the biggest stories of the year, you have to start, I think, with the crime rate. And I don't like, as a newspaper, we don't cover last night's crime, and we don't do that on this show. But we did more crime shows this year, I think, than we've ever done in terms of having the mayors on. We had the new police director on, because what are these strategies? The Operation Safe Community. I think 2 weeks ago we had Bill Gibbons on and Josh Spickler and Worth Morgan. But your thoughts, Toby, on this really tragic year in terms of the violent crime rate and the murder rate specifically?
Yeah, and it was without a doubt the biggest story of the year, coming off of the election of Jim Strickland, who ran on a real tough on crime platform. To see while the overall crime rate was lower than it was the year before, to see that murder rate set a record last year was sad, and it was tough for this community, for people to feel that number out there, and I think they did. And while there were some bright spots on the crime scene out there, that murder rate just really shone a really harsh light on a really tough subject for us. Yeah,
Burnell, your thoughts on it? I mean, there've been years overall of getting the crime rate down, getting the violent crime rate down, and then nationally this spike. And criminologists say, look, we won't figure this out for years. We're going to have some perspective to look back at why this happened nationally in 2016.
Yeah, there are, around the country, those issues popped up, and I think, when we look at it, here in Memphis, we went from 151 in 2015 to around 228, I think was the number, or somewhere close to that. But then when you look at it, you say we got a population of 650,000 people. That represents about 0.3% of the population. So, I think when you start really putting numbers behind that, anytime you have murders and those kind of things, it's an issue. But when you also look at the percentages, though, I think there's some other issues that we can focus on in terms of poverty and other things like that. And so, I think it's important that news outlets kind of put the perspective where it needs to be.
Well, and we did, and we tried to do that. I mean, on the shows we did, the most recent show with Bill Gibbons, who's head of Operation Safe Community now, former DA, former head of Tennessee Department of Homeland Security. Josh Spickler, who I mentioned, was on the show a couple times talking. He's a Just City in criminal justice reform. And it is a reminder that, of that murder rate, 50+% are drug or gang related. Something like 3/4 or another third of them are domestic violence. That doesn't mean it's any less tragic, but it is that sense of fear that I think often the news media plays up, that sort of there's a murderer and it's, we're living in the Wild West or something. It really doesn't work that way.
Exactly. There are people who know each other, who have, conflicts, and a lot of it is just personal situations that arise where people don't have the skills or et cetera to sort of resolve things without violence. So I think, it's not like we have, serial killers or people, walking around here, preying on innocent people. I don't think that's the majority of the violent murders that we see.
Right. And in terms of, I mentioned justice reform, and again, some of the shows we did that I thought the best show we've ever done was with Reverend Norman, with Harold Collins, who's involved with Operation Safe Community now, and Josh Spickler, I think we did in the spring. It's on the website, talking about and educating me on this whole thing of, why that group, at least, and many other people nationally want to see sentencing reform.
Sure.
So that what happens, and Harold Collins laid it out in a way I can't, but that, you've got a young man who's got a broken taillight, he's got an expired license, he's going to work, he gets pulled over a couple of times, he gets a couple $100 worth of fees. That couple $100 worth of fees is a deal breaker for him, and pretty soon he ends up a night in jail.
Right.
And it was an amazing show. Again, not for anything I did, just because those guys were able to articulate this and how we need to change these from their point of view, change the sentences so that the police and the court system and the prison system can focus on violent crime, not all this petty crime.
And I think that's what you're going to see this year. I think groups like Just City, others, you've got some of the younger members of the city council. They've started to say we need to be tough on crime, but we need to be smart on crime. And I think a lot of what they're going to try to do is to limit access to the criminal justice system, even starting in with juveniles. Keep those folks out of that system. So, like you said, it doesn't snowball from a broken taillight to some fees to a lifelong offender.
Yeah.
Also, even with the reform of the marijuana ordinances and the sentences and trying to change that. We saw it in Nashville, we saw it in Memphis. There's some trepidation because of the Attorney General sort of ruling that some of these things may not be able to come into play. But I think we'll see more of that approach as we move forward to try and reduce people's likelihood of getting introduced into the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting we had Berlin Boyd, who will be council chair this year, on to talk about it. And when that proposal first came forward, I think many of us in the media had a lot of fun. There were a lot of fun headlines, but it was really a much more serious issue. It wasn't about encouraging people to smoke pot and all the kind of fun stuff that the headline writers got to do. It was about saying, look, this is happening. It's a minor offense. We need to allow the police to focus on more important things. And then you had other people, we had people on the show saying, look, and Mike Rawlings, the police director, talked about how to him that's, it may be a minor amount of marijuana, it may just be marijuana, but it's the beginning of a path. A path towards more criminality. It was a very interesting debate all year, and it was much more about justice reform and proper policing in the court system than it was about people getting high.
Right, exactly, and I think that's where you have to kind of draw the line. I mean, I think decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana is a smart approach, as we see across the country, even with our neighbors, next door in Arkansas, now legalizing medical marijuana. I think that's going to have. I mean, clearly it'll have an impact here. It'll be interesting to see how they implement that, going forward.
Yeah, and there was a proposal for some amount of legalization in the Tennessee legislature. It was right, wasn't it a trial bill? About it didn't. I don't think it passed, but you can just see it creeping forward nationally. With every election season, a certain state will have a referendum, or they'll have laws passed that it becomes legal, and it feels like that's the direction things are going.
And a similar bill is coming up, or is proposed this session by 2 Republicans. So if that tells you anything about this, and like you said, it's to these folks, it's not about getting high. It's about keeping folks out of jail on these things. Right. And I think that one with Berlin Boyd was the most defined situation with that.
Yeah. Let's move on a little bit. It was Mayor Strickland's first year. Thoughts on his first year? I mean,
well, I mean, I think it was certainly very, very interesting. I don't think that he or anyone in his administration sort of anticipated some of the issues that we had relative to crime, relative to the murder rate being a record year, but there were some wins there, in terms of some of the economic development projects that we saw come on, companies like IKEA opening, and
ServiceMaster coming downtown.
ServiceMaster coming downtown, and so I think he could count some wins. Certainly, the hiring of Police Director Rawlings. Even after the bridge situation and that kind of thing, but him, sort of defining that and doing it on his own terms, saying, hey, we're going to see the process out. I'm not going to be bullied into making a decision, but I'll make the right decision for the community. And so he showed the ability to have some moxie and say, hey, we're going to do some smart things, but we're going to do it in an orderly way. And I think he's laid a foundation on which he can build on going forward to the second year of his term.
And along those lines, I think the plus side, his relation with the council this past year was very different than the relation that Wharton had with the council. Wharton had a very, very just increasingly tense and difficult relationship with the council. And part he had a couple people on the council planning to run against him, and that may have been part of it. But they passed that budget this year in record time, little fanfare, little screaming and yelling. It was, and again with a council that was 6 new members, give or take. That was interesting, and maybe that bodes well for them getting things done in the coming year.
Or it could be, these council members, they'll have a year on them, so when they go through that budget process again, things are a little more tenuous. We'll see there. We've already seen Janice Fullilove kind of taking some shots at Strickland, but that's her role. That's what she does. But as far as Strickland's first year, that I think is interesting, he's brilliant at the basics. Is what he's always said he wanted to do. Yeah. And we saw 911 calls answered, that call time reduced. We also saw, lots of paving this year. These kind of kind of boring things,
Right.
you know, that he's done a really good job at.
Right, but basic things that really help
Yeah.
improve people's basic quality of life. You know, things that people complain about, like you said, potholes in the street
Yeah.
and things like that.
Well, and he said, you know, I think he said on the show, and I saw him say it at a couple of forums, he said, you know, people wonder why I put in, an increase of $10 million, just $10 million more for potholes and paving. And he said, people are criticizing me. He said, anyone who criticizes me for that has never been to a community meeting. Because that is the first thing. He said it was wild. I mean, like, you know, you just go from community meeting, wanting to talk about crime, want to talk about big issues, want to talk about pension reform, and they'd say, I got a pothole in my street right here. And he said, you know, we just got to deal with that. There was also a joke about him, the Brilliant of the Basics thing became almost a drinking game, that every time he said Brilliant of the Basics, you could do a shot. That was actually, a friend of mine suggested that, because he did say that every forum, every talk, every time he was on the show.
Right.
But that also got into, you know, there was some criticism of him in terms of focusing just on the basics, that some of the big things weren't going to happen. And the most notable one was the proposal for Mud Island, and Andy Cates of the Cates family, who we had on the show to talk about it, you know, his proposal, and getting very frustrated that he couldn't get the attention of the mayor's office to get that project done. And you know, there were other people saying, look, I mean, are we just going to be Brilliant at the Basics? Things like Crosstown, things like Service Master are big, and they take time, and we need those big things, and we need the potholes filled.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Mud Island is, you know, clearly right now eyesore, but I think it's also a great opportunity, and to not put the time and attention to really, when you have somebody like Andy Cates in our community, who's, you know, clearly you know, a brilliant business person who loves the city and wants to see something positive happen there. I think we missed an opportunity. Not to say that we can't come back and get it right, but you know, I think that is an example of where, you know, sometimes you gotta do both. You can't just say, hey, we're just gonna focus on the foundational issues and not focus on the aspirational issues.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we are.
But it seemed to me, in that situation, you know, he's just coming off of winning this election where he preached he was going to be brilliant at the basics. And, you know, I think some folks out there were just kind of tired, had a little fatigue on these big, huge projects like Beale Street Landing or
Pyramid,
all
which
those.
has only been open a year and a half, Bass Pro.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, we had all these big blockbusters, and I think, you know, it was just, again, that fatigue of just saying, well, let's just back off, let's not spend any more money or take on any more debt, you know, and let's just do these small things we need to get taken care of.
Yeah. There were, though, big, you know, in this year past, and they'll begin to play out in this year coming up. We talk about downtown, the Pinch District, and St. Jude. St. Jude announces $1 billion to $1.5 billion capital investment in its existing footprint and into the Pinch District, which has been abandoned, all but abandoned for a decade now. That was huge, and clearly the administration and the state and everybody came together to get them the public money they needed and to get that started. And even the St. Jude thing that is amazing to me is that they're increasing their budget by $1 billion a year and hiring, is it 1,000 or 2,000 people? It's
Right.
unbelievable
It's amazing.
the impact
it is simply
that's going to have.
amazing, and Memphis is blessed to have an institution like St. Jude, world-renowned, doing great things, impacting families, in more ways than one. Not only the patients they serve, but when you look at the people that are being recruited here and the staff that they have, they're highly recognized as one of the most favorable employers to work for. You know, sort of amazing, you know, amazing organization to have in our community.
Other big developments, when Service Master coming downtown was huge. You know, we had the Peabody Place Mall. Is that what it was?
Yeah,
Peabody?
yeah.
And which had been empty. You had rumors that Service Master, they were looking, and they said they were looking at other cities. They had a lot of incentive packages from other cities to possibly go. And you really had the triple win. You had them, you know, that empty building, I guess it'd been empty, 5 or 10 years,
Right.
Yeah.
gets a new tenant, you get 1,000 people coming downtown, and you get a company that didn't move out of town. And it's been remarkable for people who haven't seen it. I mean, they're moving along. They're supposed to move in sometime this coming year. Well, Crosstown, your thoughts on Crosstown? That will finally happen this year.
Yeah, and that's going to be, I think, one of the biggest developments of 2017. They're going to open this summer, but folks are going to start moving in this month in January, and then businesses are going to start moving in through February all the way. I think Alsac's going to be the last one to move in October. And I mean, just talk about you know, just a bomb of energy that's going to happen in that place and the surrounding area over there. It's going to be incredible. You know, 1 million square feet of something that was, you know, all boarded up and vacant, and now it's going to be vibrant and
It was a
alive.
huge pigeon coop, essentially. Yeah. That's now, you know, it'll have a charter school, Crosstown High School. I saw where they announced they're hiring where they're announcing that they're going to hire executive director. You've got the church health center going in there. I mean, it's sort of this coming together of all these different kinds of service organizations and community organizations and businesses.
YMCA, a grocery store. There's going to be a brewery, a theater.
Revitalize that that area of town.
Well, and speaking of, we talked a little bit before the show, the Foot Homes, the last of the, what were there 10 big sprawling housing projects that were built in the 40s and 50s, 60s. Real concentrations of poverty. I know there are people, and I want to say this carefully because there are people who grew up there and there are people who have fond memory of those, but they've been systematically, the city, county, the federal government has been replacing them. The last one is what, to the south of FedEx Forum, Foot Homes. They're calling it now South City, I think. That starts this year?
Right, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, I think everyone can admit that housing projects were failed experiments, government experiments, where you isolated people for generations and generations in poverty, made it very difficult for people to be able to escape those environments. And so I think, you know, Memphis, and I have to give Robert Liscombe a lot of credit for, you know, being able to sort of lead this charge to sort of, you know, change what public housing looks like in Memphis. There's a need for public housing, but clearly in that form or fashion, I think now we're moving forward in a way that will transform south of downtown and in parts of South Memphis and create a new paradigm, you know, downtown. And hopefully some of those individuals that were in that area are also able to participate in that development.
Also downtown, just to focus downtown, it was in our office is downtown. The number of hotels that went in and that are going in is notable. And it'll be interesting in 2017, we had Kevin Kane on from the Convention Visitors Bureau, and it gets back to the whole Mud Island development. There's a puzzle, you know, of the funding and the tax incentive funding that's going to go into the pinch and help support what we talked about, the St. Jude. You've got the convention center, and Kevin Kane and others make a really strong case that we don't need $1 billion convention center, but we need an expanded convention center. They're doing about $50 million, I think, worth of renovations this year, and he'd like to see them do more, and that would draw more people downtown. And then you've got Mud Island, but it is amazing. I mean, we talked before the show. You've got the Harahan Bridge open to walk across, and people who haven't, I did it with my family this weekend. It's just a It's fantastic in this really strangely simplistic way. It's not rockets and crazy. But you're kind of walking along, and there's a barge going under you, and it'll be interesting into 2017 as the Wolf River Conservancy begins to open up its greenway in segments. That won't all get done in 2017, but you know, you think about how popular the Green Line has been, or this Harahan Bridge has been. Well, there's gonna be more and more. I mean, miles and miles of that opening. I'm not sure people are fully aware that that's.
Yeah, you know, I think just you know, the ongoing development with Shelby Farms and what's happening there, the expansion of the Green Line. You know, even going, let's look at Whitehaven. Look at the guest house at Graceland. I mean, that is an incredible. I don't know if you guys have been there, but it's an incredible facility there, and all the surrounding development that'll come from that, I think, is just dynamic for the Whitehaven community. Yeah,
they're opening their a couple 100,000 square feet of new space or something. There's a bunch that's about to open up down there, and then streetscape, city improvements, and so on down in Whitehaven. What else this past year? I mean, one of the big things was switching back to more on the political side, and it's going to be a huge issue, I think. Possibly the biggest story of 2017 is de-annexation.
You know, you talked about the budget earlier. Its potential impact on the city of Memphis budget may be the thing that actually starts to cause some contention between the city council and Mayor Strickland administration, because that you know if you're either going to start to kind of claw back and allow some of these areas of town that were annexed to sort of de-annexed, or you're going to deal with some of the impacts of this legislation that they start moving forward with that. So
there's been just a committee formed, and they've been meeting to talk about how do we de-annex smartly. You know, how do we do it focused and in a I lost
orderly,
the word. Orderly way, thank you. Rather than the state just coming in and saying, everybody can do it, and then everybody jumps out, and then we deal with the financial ramifications.
Right. I'll be curious how it goes. I mean, because you do have the neighborhoods that it started with were the last couple that got brought in to the city, and that was Southwind and South Cordova, I think. And I apologize if I screwed that up. But you've got the city council has to vote. As the law stands now, the city council has to vote to let them go back to be unincorporated county or wherever. And there are a lot of council members and they were on the show, a couple of them were on the show recently, and they said, no, I don't see any reason to do it. And if they don't, we know what happened with consolidation and deconsolidation of schools. Nashville will step in. The legislature will step in eventually if they don't like, I mean, right or wrong, they will step in. So that'll be a huge issue as the legislature convenes in the next couple of weeks. Another big one, just talking about the state, is the state has this huge surplus. We had Mark Norris, the Senate Majority Leader, and Lee Harris, the Senate Minority Leader, on. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that huge surplus, a $500 million surplus. You got Brian Kelsey and others came forward with an idea of shifting some of that sales tax money back to cities. I mean, cities are hurting across the state.
Yeah, I think Kelsey's proposal was, I've not always agreed with a lot of some of his proposals, but I think that one makes a lot of sense. A lot of our cities are hurting. They could utilize that money and put it back to use to, particularly Memphis could really use that. So
well, and you had this. I quoted a couple of times or paraphrased Haslam, the governor, who was a former mayor, talking about this growing anti-city tone in the legislature, and making the point that most of the economic activity, most of the revenue, most of the people are concentrated in the 4 or 5 big cities in Tennessee, and yet the legislature, by design, has a whole lot of rural and non-city folks making decisions that, in some cases, are really potentially harmful to the cities. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
What is it, like 80% of the state revenues come from the 4 big cities?
Right.
Yeah.
And then folks like Haslam, they see guys like Andy Holt out there making the decisions and pushing these things down, and it's, nobody's got a taste for that.
And again, just 2 things on the state to look ahead to as the legislature convenes, and we're hoping to have the governor on sometime in the next month or so. But with Norris and Harris, who we just had on, road funding, the governor wants to fund roads. He's been wanting to fund roads for a couple of years now, and it's a legislature that is not particularly interested in spending a lot of money or raising taxes to do that. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with Obamacare. You got 230,000 people in Tennessee who are in the exchanges. We've got a new presidential administration coming in. So where we went from, it's kind of interesting, we went from talking about Medicaid expansion, now we're talking about, I don't know that Medicaid expansion is even going to be possible, and 200 and something thousand people who could potentially be out of the exchanges. Now maybe the Trump administration and the Republicans will have a new and better plan, but it's very uncertain in terms of what happens with health care in this country.
I think that this is the Trump administration has sort of clawed back. Hey, we're just going to repeal. I think what they realize is that it has had some benefits, but it has to be sort of modified in terms of the approach, and it'll be interesting to see what that modification looks like and how it plays out for Tennesseans, because there are hundreds of thousands of Tennesseans who have who need that health care, and there are at least probably 100,000 more who still don't have access to health care.
Yeah.
And and if they fall off Obamacare, they're going to head right back to TennCare, and then and then create that other big hole in our budget again.
Right. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Back more local, it is a reappraisal year, so tax reappraisal for the city and county and all the municipalities. And we've done a number of stories lately. I mean, housing prices are up. When they do a reappraisal, they look back at the last 2 years of activity. So a lot of this commercial activity we're talking about, office space, industrial space had record years, and residential real estate has really bounced back from where it was in the heart of the recession. So it'll be interesting what happens with the tax rate. It might create a little breathing room for the county and the city.
Absolutely, it should, given the fact that I think the last time we saw the impact of the Great Recession sort of reduce tax numbers. This will be an opportunity to sort of see recover from that.
Right. We meant to talk before the show about Beale Street. Always in flux. The Downtown Memphis Commission has been managing it for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
What happens next?
It was essentially supposed to be a 6-month deal. It's now turned into almost a 3-year deal, and there's the Group 21 bill that essentially won this bid to sort of take over, but the merchants decided they weren't comfortable. DMC stepped back in and said, "Hey, we'll continue to manage the street." And so I think there's that's going to continue to be a battle. But ultimately, I don't know that DMC is the entity to continue to run Beale Street long term in terms of its growth and evolution. So the city is going to have to decide. Now you have to also have this Beale Street Authority group, and so there's sort of some mixed emotions and issues around
Yeah.
who's actually on first, who's going to
Yeah.
run this and decide, where Beale Street ultimately ends, which is again one of Memphis's jewels.
Right.
Just like Graceland, you got Beale Street.
Yeah.
You've got these great assets, but we also have to figure out how we're going to grow them and make them better.
And maybe, I don't know, I think you've been covering, if you haven't, I'll put you on the spot anyway, the aquifer in TVA. That's going to be a big issue this year. And for people who haven't followed, TVA is building a new gas-powered power plant to replace the dirty old coal-fired one. But they announced that they're going to dig into the Memphis aquifer, get water directly, and for a lot of water for that plant.
Right.
Thoughts?
And they got the green line, from the board that oversees, groundwater quality here. They won that battle. I think they started drilling those extra 2 wells immediately. I think the group that was fighting them at that level said that they were going to go and take them to Chancery Court and continue the fight, but we'll see how it goes. But it all but seems certain that TVA is going to tap into the well, to which they say that they've got a lot of quality controls in place and things to, if they're not going to damage the aquifer. But I think a lot of folks are kind of skeptical.
Yeah. I think that one will play out because, they've used water. I mean, we have tremendous water resources. It's been an economic development resource. We had a couple of local brewers on this here talking about how easy it is to make good beer in Memphis because of that water, which sounds a flippant way to end the show. But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, it's a very serious issue, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Thank you both for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week.